Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Otomi podcast. Today, we're going to have an interesting episode. In light of many of the crimes that we've been seeing today against our Asian American brothers and sisters, I thought it would be very appropriate to present on a topic that I think is not very well known and is definitely relevant to the situation we're seeing today in the United States. And this topic is anti-Asian hate in Latin America, which has been prevalent for many, many centuries. So today we're going to be talking about the Torreón Massacre, which was a race-based, an act of racial hatred that was not provoked against the Chinese community of the city of Torreón in Coahuila, Mexico. This was a terrible act that led to a diplomatic crisis between China and Mexico, where the Chinese government demanded 30 million pesos for reparations of what occurred. And in this massacre, 303 Chinese residents of the city were killed by revolutionary forces of Francisco Madero. All right, let's get into this. ¿Qué onda? Soy Sebastián y este podcast es Otomi. For all of my non-Spanish native speakers, this is Sebastian, and I'm a high school student in the Bay Area. I've got the facts and the opinions. Join me as we discuss topics of society, culture, identity, education, and life. The Torreón Massacre takes place in 1911 during the Mexican Revolution of 1910, but we're going to be taking a look at the history of Chinese immigration before the 1900s. So Chinese immigration to Mexico began in the 17th century. Now it increased significantly during the late 1800s under the president Porfirio Diaz. Now Porfirio Diaz served for 31 years as president of Mexico. In 1984, he abandoned the policy of no re-election that all of the other presidents had followed, and he ran continuously, holding office. He for 7 terms, for a total of 31 years, and finally in 1911, when he declared himself to be once again for his 8th term the president of Mexico, his opponent, Francisco Madero, started the Mexican Revolution, and this was the motivating factor in that revolution. Porfirio Diaz was open to Chinese immigration because he saw it as a cheap source of labor. Now, by 1910, there were 13,200 Chinese immigrants throughout Mexico, primarily in Baja California, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Sinaloa, Sonora, and Yucatan. The Chinese community became the second largest group of immigrants in the city of Torreón by 1900. Now, the city of Torreón was located between 2 intersecting railroads, and this was a site where many Chinese immigrants immigrated to. There was the China Reform Association that established there and made a bank. And it was and there were many investments made by Chinese leaders and even exiles from China who wanted to test Chinese immigration to Mexico and Brazil. But they used Torreón kind of as an experimental city where they could see how that immigration would take place and how well Chinese immigrants would be able to integrate to the Hispanic society. Now, in 1907, there was a gathering by Mexican businessmen in the Chamber of Commerce to protect their businesses, and they targeted the Chinese immigrants as the cause of their plight. They didn't specifically mention them, but they insinuated that immigrant groups were causing the downfall of their businesses, and making them economically unsuccessful. A monopoly of the grocery market, in addition to success, just the general success of the Chinese population of the city, led to major resentment by the Mexican population, the native Mexican population. During the speeches made on Independence Day of September 16th, 1910, there was clear anti-Chinese resentment. On May 5th of 1911, revolutionary Jesus Flores had a public speech in Durango. And in Durango, he argued that the Chinese people put Mexican workers out of jobs. They monopolized businesses, and he said that, and they sent money back to China. That was what he argued. And this riled the people up. And in the end, his final demand was that all Chinese residents be expelled. That's his final say in the speech. I mean, clearly there was this anti-Chinese sentiment held by many of the revolutionaries because they wanted to consolidate power. And they, as we see in many different historical situations, when a group wants to take power, they want to create a common enemy and antagonize groups so that way they can join forces, join people together with a common goal. You see that in many, many different instances of ethnic genocide and targeting of other groups. So in the same year of 1911, Francisco Madero's brother, Emilio Madero, attacked the city of Torreón on May 13th. Remember, these forces were trying to take power because they were revolutionary forces, they were rebels, and Torreón was actually the last city that they took, the last large city. So they wanted the railroads for control of the region. As I mentioned before, there was the intersection of two railroads there. That was very important, and the Madero forces, the Maderistas, wanted to take that land. And so as the Maderistas came to take Torreón, the Federales, who were there already, Porfirio Díaz's army, they were defending themselves, defending the city. And now these General Emiliano Lojero had 670 Federales in the city to basically fend off those Maderistas who were encroaching and trying to take the land. They put the city of Torreón under siege. So in the city of Torreón, surrounding the city were many Chinese residential areas known as the Chinese Gardens, and they surrounded the city. Now, the people who worked there, they basically were overrun by the forces of the Federales. And the Federales used the Chinese houses and the Chinese gardens as fortifications against the rebels who were advancing. And they forced the Chinese homeowners to prepare them food and to really take care of them while they were staying in those homes. Now, what happened was there was one night they were running low on munitions. And of course, running low on munitions, Lojero had to retreat, and all his forces abandoned the city. So the city was open for the Maderistas to take over. Now, remember that revolutionary Jesus Flores, who was a Maderista. He made a speech, again, another one, calling for the extermination of the Chinese immigrants. This was right when the Maderistas were attacking. So when the rebel Maderista forces entered the city of Torreón, they were accompanied by a mob of 4,000 men, women, and children from surrounding cities. And they basically started sacking the different districts of the city. They looted stores, they robbed people, they freed prisoners, And it was just, they were attacking people. And when they made it to the Chinese district, that's when things got really bad. They dragged the Chinese people from their gardens to the town. Because remember, the gardens were in the surrounding district. They were in the outskirts of the city. So the Chinese people would be tied, their legs tied to the tail of a horse, and they'd just be dragged all the way to the center of the city. If they fell off, if they came loose from the ropes, they would be either they would be trampled by the horses, or they would be shot and executed by those atop the horses. And I mean, there were just very gruesome details of what happened. There were people whose limbs were torn apart. There were children who had their brains splattered, just bashed in. Now, there were some people who tried to save and help these Chinese immigrants. 70 immigrants were saved by just one tailor who misdirected a mob hunting a group of Chinese people, and he told them to go in the other direction, and that saved 70 immigrants. Now, 10 hours after this massacre occurred, Madero, the leader, Francisco Madero, arrived in Torreón. Once he arrived, Madero proclaimed a decree of the death penalty for anyone who killed a Chinese person. Now, understand, this was 10 hours later, 10 hours after the massacre had begun. And this was when the massacre ended. So 10 hours of this massacre went by. Afterwards, the surviving Chinese people were put into a building with a group of soldiers selected by Madero to protect them. The Maderistas who died during this massacre were buried in a cemetery, while the Chinese people were simply stripped naked and buried in a communal trench. There was a military tribunal on the same day as the massacre, and there the Maderistas were accused of committing atrocities, terrible crimes against the Chinese people of Torreón. However, the soldiers defended themselves by saying that the Chinese victims were armed and that they were acting in self-defense. This was not true, but this is what they said in order to save face and to not receive as bad or as severe of a punishment. So in conclusion, 1,000 Chinese people fled Torreón to Guadalajara, asking to go home, back to China. And the statistics say that, okay, many Maderistas were killed in this massacre, and they were the violent ones. They are the ones who provoked, obviously. Now, the Chinese people of the city didn't provoke anything at all, but they definitely were terribly affected by this massacre. They were the targeted group. 303 Chinese people were killed, and 5 Japanese people were killed. And I saw that the reason the Japanese people were killed is because they had similar features to the Chinese people, so they were just killed as well. And I think that it's relevant because especially here where I live, this is the Silicon Valley, right? And in Silicon Valley, people have this sort of illusion that Asian people of Asian descent, Asian Americans, are immune to this sort of treatment, immune to this prejudicial treatment because they're very successful in our country. And of course, there are many different ethnic groups, many different Asian ethnic groups. If you're going to say Pacific Islanders, if you're going to say South Asians, Southeast Asians, Indonesians, Filipinos, East Asians, Central Asians, West Asians, or what some people call the Middle East. There are many, many different groups, and they're different ethnicities, different phenotypes, different cultures, different languages. And in this country, a lot of the time, we tend to generalize the term Asian to East Asians and to an extent also South Asians. But this is definitely an important discussion to have. because it seems like only now a lot of people are realizing, hey, there's racism against Asian people, which has been happening for a very long time, definitely in Latin America too, because the immigration of Asian people has been quite prevalent, just as it is here in the United States. Today I chose to talk about Mexico, but we can get into discussions of other instances as well, including in Brazil, where a large Japanese population immigrated. Same with Peru, where many Japanese individuals immigrated. So there are many different instances that we have there. Today, I said to keep it concise and informative, we're sticking with the Torreón Massacre, but it's definitely relevant to what's happening today. And I think that it's important that we look at the past and look at the patterns of the past of how people have been treated, and look to the future and say, let's not let that happen again. Let's prevent this odious sentiment from really entering our society, which right now in many different communities it is. There's strong sentiment against Asian people, unfortunately, and we need really to end that. And this pandemic really hasn't helped. But I'll see you guys next time. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I feel like it's a historical topic because I was talking about something that happened 110 years ago, but it is very relevant to the events that are occurring today in our contemporary times. So thank you all. See you later.